My name is Eleanor Ellison, and I've lived in the small mountain town of Cedar Hollow, Vermont, all my life. If you drove through it too quickly, you might miss it entirely. A single blinking stoplight, 2 diners that close by 8, and the kind of silence that sits in your bones if you let it. Some people call that silence loneliness. I call it peace. Every morning, I walk 3 blocks down Maple Street to my little second-hand bookshop. The sign above the door is chipped and fading, Ellison's Books and Curiosities, and the paint peels a bit in the winter wind, but I can't bring myself to repaint it. Henry made that sign by hand the summer Christopher was born, carving the letters late at night while the baby and I slept upstairs. Sometimes I run my fingers over those grooves, rough and worn, and it feels like holding his hand again. Inside, the shop smells like old paper and cinnamon tea. There are just 3 crooked aisles, crowded with mismatched shelves that never quite stand straight. The floors creak in complaint with every step, and the bell above the door tinkles like laughter when someone walks in. It's not much, certainly nothing fancy, but it's mine. Every book has a story, and so do the people who come looking for them. I suppose I collect both. After Henry passed away 6 years ago, a sudden heart attack on a September evening, this shop became my refuge. My anchor. There were days I didn't want to get out of bed, when the house felt cavernous and echoing, like someone had scooped the warmth out of it. But the shop needed me. The books needed dusting, the window needed washing, and Mrs. Carter from across the street needed her weekly copy of the Sunday crossword collection. It gave me rhythm. It gave me something to care for when the person I'd built my life around was simply gone. Christopher, my only son, was 26 then. He had just started climbing the rungs of a prestigious finance firm in Boston. He came home for the funeral, stood at the pulpit in his tailored black suit, and delivered a perfect eulogy that made everyone in the church cry. But the night before, I heard him on the phone in the kitchen, whispering about mergers and deadlines, his voice tight and clipped. Even grief couldn't loosen his tie. Since then, our lives have drifted like 2 leaves on different currents. He calls occasionally, usually on Sunday mornings if he remembers, but our conversations are clipped, efficient, like business meetings with an emotional script. "How's the shop doing?" he'll ask, not really waiting for the answer. "Still standing," I'll say, and he'll laugh like it's a punchline. He's 32 now, and in his mind, my little bookshop is a hobby, not a real business. He sends me gift cards for fancy department stores I never use and suggests, half joking, half not, that I should sell the building and retire somewhere sunny. I smile and let him believe what he wants. He thinks success is measured in skyscrapers and stock portfolios. I know better. Success is when the morning light hits the window just right and turns the dust motes into golden confetti while you unlock your shop door. Success is when someone walks in broken-hearted and leaves with a book that stitches them back together. Still, I miss him. The real him. The boy who used to spend whole afternoons curled up in the shop's armchair, devouring fantasy novels until his eyelids drooped. The boy who built forts out of the bookshop's cardboard boxes and charged customers at a dragon tax of 2 jelly beans to enter. The boy who believed in magic without ever needing to see it. Now he wears custom suits and speaks in the sharp, quick sentences of someone who doesn't have time for softness. He never quite says it out loud, but I can feel it in the pauses, in the sigh between his words. He thinks I'm small. He thinks this town is small. He thinks I chose smallness, when really, I chose love. Cedar Hollow has a way of making people think smallness is failure. Maybe that's why so many young ones leave. The mountains cradle us, yes, but they also block the horizon. People like Christopher see the lack of billboards and bustle and think it means we have nothing here. But they don't see how, on winter nights, the snow wraps around the town like a quilt, and every window glows with golden light. They don't see the way everyone shows up when someone's pipes burst or when someone's heart breaks. There's wealth here, just not the kind you can hold in your hands. Christmas has always been different, though. Christmas was our bridge. Even after he moved away, Christopher used to come home every year, stomping snow from his boots at the door, cheeks pink from the cold. We would drink cocoa and stay up too late playing board games, the house loud with laughter. He would tease me for hanging the same faded stockings and playing the same Bing Crosby record on repeat, but he'd hum along anyway. Back then, Christmas felt like a truce between our two worlds. He would set down his briefcase, and I would set aside my loneliness, and for a few days, we would just be mother and son again, messy and imperfect in ours. But then the visits stopped. One year he said he had too much work. The next year, he booked a ski trip with friends instead. Then it was simply easier not to come at all. He sent gifts by courier, sleek, expensive things wrapped in glossy paper, with notes written in his assistant's handwriting. I told myself it was fine. That this was adulthood, that children are meant to leave. But every December, when the first snow dusted the shop windows, I caught myself setting 2 mugs by the fireplace instead of 1. Old habits have a way of keeping their shape, even when the person they were made for is gone. I suppose that's why I keep the shop exactly as it's always been. The shelves still lean, the bell still jingles, and the sign still peels. It's a time capsule, stubborn and still. Maybe I am, too. And yet, deep down, in the quiet place I don't show anyone, I keep hoping. Hoping that one day he'll come back not just to visit, but to see. To see me, not as the woman who stayed small, but as the woman who made a world inside these 4 walls. Because the truth is, this bookshop isn't small. It's vast. Every page here holds entire galaxies. Every spine is a doorway. Every story is a universe. Christopher used to know that, once. Christmas. Christmas has always been our bridge. Or at least, it used to be. The first snow of December dusted the shop windows like sifted sugar when Christopher called to say he'd be coming home for Christmas dinner. I was in the back room of the shop, unpacking a box of donated books that smelled like attic air and old memories, when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I've grown used to calls being from delivery services or the bank, but when I saw his name glowing on the screen, my breath caught like a stitch in my chest. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice smooth, polished. "Christopher," I breathed, pressing the phone closer to my ear, as if that could bring him nearer. "I thought I'd come home this year. For Christmas. Just dinner, though, I can't stay long." My hands stilled over the stack of books. For a moment, I couldn't speak. He hadn't been home in 3 years. 3 Christmases of watching other people embrace their children on Main Street, of pretending I didn't notice the empty chair at the table. "That would be wonderful," I whispered, and I meant it so deeply that my throat ached. After he hung up, already rushing off to another meeting, I sat alone in the quiet of the shop, my fingers trembling on the receiver. Outside, snow swirled gently down Maple Street, catching the yellow glow of the lampposts. My heart felt too big for my ribs. He was coming home. Even if just for one night, he was coming home. That evening, I stood in the kitchen, staring at my old recipe box. The cards were yellowed, edges curled, Henry's handwriting scrawled across half of them like echoes of his laughter. My eyes landed on one labeled, Grandma Edna's Molasses Cookies. I hadn't baked them in years, not since Christopher was a teenager and declared them old-fashioned compared to chocolate chip. But when he was small, he used to sneak them off the cooling rack, sugar crystals sparkling on his lips, grinning like he'd stolen treasure. I baked them slowly, the way his grandmother taught me, measuring the dark syrup until it dripped like winter shadows, whipping butter until it gleamed pale and soft. The scent filled the house, spiced and rich, the smell of a childhood winter wrapped in quilts. I lined the warm cookies on a plate, and for a second, I almost saw a much smaller Christopher running through the kitchen, socks sliding on the linoleum, begging for just one more. The next day, I climbed up to the attic, where the air smelled of cedar and forgotten summers. I pulled out the dusty box of Christmas ornaments. My hands trembled as I lifted each one, glass bells that caught the light like trapped raindrops, wooden soldiers Henry carved with a pocket knife when we couldn't afford store-bought ones, and finally, tucked at the bottom, the faded paper star Christopher made in kindergarten. It was crooked and wrinkled, glitter flaking off like golden snow. His name was scrawled across the back in shaky red crayon. I held it against my chest. He used to climb onto Henry's shoulders every year to place that star on top of the tree. He would laugh when it tilted and proclaim it perfect anyway. It was still perfect. Maybe more so now, because of how fragile it had become, like him. Like us. I spent hours decorating the little tree in the corner of the living room, humming softly to myself. I wrapped the banister with twinkle lights and set the old Bing Crosby record on the turntable, letting it crackle to life. The house glowed the way it used to, warm and welcoming, like it had been waiting for him all along. And then, there was the matter of his gift. I sat at the shop counter that evening after closing, the windows fogged with frost, staring at my ledger. The truth was, I couldn't afford anything extravagant. The shop brings in enough to keep me afloat, but not enough for lavish gestures. Christopher had grown used to expensive things, leather briefcases, imported watches, sleek gadgets that seemed to belong in another world entirely. I couldn't compete with that, and I didn't want to. But I wanted something meaningful. Something that would cut through the armor he wears now, that could remind him, just for a moment, of who he used to be. Of the boy who once drew spaceships on napkins and read books under the covers by flashlight until his eyes ached. Of the boy who used to say he'd become an artist and build worlds no one had ever seen. That night, long after midnight, I wandered into the storage room of the shop to fetch a broom, and that's when I found it. A faded shoebox shoved behind a sagging shelf, covered in dust. I almost ignored it, thinking it belonged to an old donation, but something about the way the corner of the lid curled up made me pause. I pulled it free, sneezing as dust plumed into the air. Inside were his drawings. Stacks of them. Dragons and astronauts, pirate ships floating through space, robots with violin bows, castles on clouds. Page after page of bright, wild, impossible things, drawn in the shaky, passionate hand of a child who hadn't learned yet to doubt himself. I sank to the floor right there in the dim storage light, tears stinging my eyes as I turned each one over. I had forgotten how many there were, how vivid, how strange and beautiful. These were the first worlds he ever built. How had he gone from this wild, unbridled dreamer, to boardrooms and numbers on glowing screens? When had the color drained out of him? He had buried this part of himself, maybe without even realizing it. And yet here it was, waiting patiently in the dark all these years, like it had been holding its breath for him to come back. I knew then what I would give him. I would gather the best of these drawings, have them gently cleaned and restored by the art student who sometimes works part-time at the shop, and place them inside a handcrafted wooden box. I knew just the carpenter, Mr. Hollis down the street, who still works by hand even though his arthritis protests every stroke. I would ask him to carve Christopher's initials into the lid. It wouldn't cost much money. But it would cost love. And I had plenty of that to give. The next morning, I swept the shop floor as sunlight spilled like honey through the frosted windows, and for the first time in years, I caught myself humming. The bell above the door jingled as Mrs. Carter came in for her weekly crossword book, and she stopped, blinking. "You look lighter," she said gently. "My boy's coming home," I replied, and the words tasted like hope. She smiled, squeezing my hand. "Then make it count." I planned everything after that as if arranging sacred pieces of a fragile spell. The cookies. The ornaments. The music. The tree. The gift that might reach through all his armor and tap the boy still sleeping inside him. He hadn't been home in 3 years. And yet, with every cookie I baked, every ornament I polished, every drawing I gently laid into its little pile, I could almost feel him drawing closer, not just across the miles from Boston to Vermont, but across the far more dangerous distance that had grown between his world and mine. For the first time in so long, my house didn't feel like a museum to what we used to be. It felt like home. Waiting for him to walk through the door. Weeks before Christmas, I found the old shoebox of Christopher's childhood drawings tucked behind a collapsing shelf in the shop storage room. It was an accident, really. I had gone back there to look for an extra length of ribbon for wrapping holiday purchases. The storage room is a cramped, dim place, smelling faintly of dust and dried lavender, its shelves sagging under the weight of forgotten donations. My shop cat, Pickle, darted between my ankles as I bent down to pull a crate of hard covers from the bottom shelf, and that's when I saw it. A corner of cracked cardboard, peeking out from behind a stack of outdated encyclopedias. I frowned and tugged it free. The lid stuck, then gave way with a soft sigh of disintegrating dust. A smell rose from it, faint cedar and old crayons, like opening a drawer in a childhood bedroom that hasn't been touched in decades. And inside, drawings. Dozens of them. Dragons coiled around lighthouses. Pirate ships sailing across a rainbow sea. Castles floating on clouds. Robots playing violins for an audience of starlings. Entire universes, crowded onto loose-leaf paper with blunt crayons and colored pencils worn down to stubs. I sank to the cold concrete floor, the box balanced on my knees. The air around me felt suddenly hushed, reverent. These were his worlds. The worlds he built when he still believed he could make anything. I remembered him then, small and serious, sprawled on the shop's rug with his tongue poking out between his teeth as he drew. He would look up at me with eyes so wide and shining it was like he was seeing through the paper, seeing the thing he was making before it existed. Someday, he used to whisper, I'll make the world see the magic inside my head. And I would smile and say, I believe you will. For a long time, I just sat there, turning the pages slowly, like they might crumble in my hands. There was so much color, so much life. And something else, too, something I hadn't seen in him for years, wonder. Where had it gone? When had it drained out of him, replaced by sleek suits and glowing phone screens? I wondered if he even remembered these drawings existed. I doubted it. He had buried this part of himself so thoroughly that even I had nearly forgotten it was ever real. But it was real. And it was beautiful. That night, long after I locked up the shop and the town had gone still under its blanket of snow, I sat at the counter with a mug of tea gone cold and made my plan. I would gather his best drawings, maybe a dozen, maybe more. I would ask Clara, the quiet art student from the community college who worked part-time at the shop on weekends, if she could help me clean and restore them. She had a delicate touch, like she was afraid of breaking beauty just by looking at it. And then I would have them framed, tiny frames, just large enough to honor each one without swallowing it. Like little windows into the boy he used to be. Finally, I would place them in a handcrafted wooden box. Not a store-bought thing from some cold department store, but something real. Something warm. I knew exactly who to ask, Mr. Hollis, the carpenter who lived 2 doors down from me. He was nearly 80, with hands like gnarled tree roots and eyes as soft as weathered oak. He still worked by hand even though his knuckles swelled from arthritis, sanding each piece of wood as if coaxing a secret out of it. I imagined asking him to carve Christopher's initials, D.E., into the lid, maybe with a small star beside them, the way Christopher used to sign his drawings when he was 7. It wouldn't be expensive. It wouldn't shine or glitter or beep or connect to Wi-Fi. But it would be soaked in love. It would be a time capsule of who he once was, of the boy who believed in magic before the world convinced him it wasn't practical. The next afternoon, I found Clara hunched over the shop's reading table, mending a broken spine on a donated copy of The Secret Garden. I showed her the drawings carefully, my voice trembling as I explained what I wanted. Her eyes widened. These are incredible, she whispered, brushing a curl from her face. He drew these as a kid? Yes, I said softly. Before the world got loud. She smiled, a little sadly, and promised she would treat them like they were her own. For the next 2 weeks, she came in after classes, gently pressing each page between blotting sheets, lifting the smudges with tiny brushes, and mounting them on acid-free backing. She never charged me a cent. I think, she said one evening, that whoever he is now, he still needs to see this part of himself. Sometimes we forget the best parts. Her words stayed with me. A few days later, I shuffled through the snow to Mr. Hollis's workshop, a squat wooden building that smelled of pine and sawdust. He listened quietly as I explained my idea, nodding slowly, his hands folded over the head of his cane. Something to hold a boy's soul, he murmured, eyes far away. A sacred thing, then. Yes, I said. My throat felt tight. Exactly that. He tapped his cane on the floor thoughtfully. Give me a week. True to his word, a week later he brought the box to my shop wrapped in burlap. It was made of walnut, smooth and rich, the color of warm earth. The hinges gleamed like old brass. On the lid, carved in looping script, were Christopher's initials, D.E., and beside them, a small 5-pointed star. Just like he used to draw. When I ran my fingers over it, the wood seemed to hum. Each night after closing, I worked alone in the shop, sliding the restored drawings into their little frames, lining them carefully in the box. Around me, the shop creaked and settled, the snow whispered at the windows, and Bing Crosby crooned faintly from the old turntable. It felt like stitching something back together, not just paper and wood, but something older and more fragile. Something invisible. By the time I finished, the box was no longer just an object. It was a world. His world. And mine too, in a way. Because I had carried these pieces of him quietly for years, even when he stopped carrying them himself. When I closed the lid for the first time, it clicked shut like the final note of a lullaby. I wrapped the box in simple brown paper and tied it with twine. No glossy wrapping, no shiny ribbon, just something honest, something true. I tucked a sprig of evergreen under the knot, because Henry always said every gift should carry a bit of the earth. Then I set it on the mantel, right below the faded paper star Christopher had made in kindergarten, and I stood there staring at it for a long time. I imagined him opening it. I imagined the way his sharp, guarded expression might falter when he saw what lay inside. Maybe his mouth would part in surprise. Maybe his eyes would shine for the first time in years. Maybe, just maybe, he would remember who he used to be. It was a small hope. But sometimes, the smallest hopes are the ones that save us. Christopher's car pulled into the driveway like a shadow with headlights, quiet and sleek against the white hush of Cedar Hollow's first deep winter snow. The sound was foreign here, where cars usually coughed and clattered their way up the hill. This one purred, sleek, black, all clean lines and arrogance, as if it had never seen a dirt road before. I stood at the living room window, my hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa, and watched the taillights glow red against the swirling flakes before they blinked out. For a moment, I just stood there, my breath caught somewhere between joy and dread. My son. My boy. He was home. The car door opened, and there he was, stepping out like an actor from a film I'd never seen. His coat was gray cashmere, long and tailored to perfection, the kind that whispered money in every stitch. His hair was shorter than I remembered, slicked back in a way that made him look older, sharper. He was carrying a leather weekender bag that probably cost more than my entire month's rent on the bookshop. And then he smiled. It was a polite, restrained smile, one that tilted his mouth but didn't trouble his eyes. "Hi, Mom," he said, as if no time had passed. "Hi, sweetheart," I whispered, but my voice caught on the last word. We hugged, awkwardly, his arms stiff, mine desperate. I smelled something expensive on him, cologne with notes of pine and smoke, like someone had bottled the idea of a luxury cabin. It made me think of how, when he was little, he used to smell like cinnamon and glue and wind from the playground. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth. I had lit it an hour before, wanting the house to feel warm when he arrived, wanting it to whisper welcome in a language older than words. The stockings were hung, the tree glowed with its soft golden lights, and the whole room smelled of pine and molasses cookies. "Cocoa?" I asked, trying to keep my voice bright. "Sure." I handed him a mug. He didn't look at it, didn't blow on it like he used to. Instead, he set it down on the table, untouched, and pulled his phone from his pocket. His thumb began its familiar dance, scrolling, tapping, swiping. His face glowed blue from the screen. For a moment, the only sounds were the fire's low crackle and the faint electronic click of his phone. "Still running the little bookshop?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the screen. "Yes," I said softly. "That's cute." There was no malice in his voice, just dismissal, like he was commenting on a child's lemonade stand. My smile faltered, but I forced it back in place. I had prepared for this, his casual condescension, the way he'd grown allergic to sentiment. He was used to skyscrapers now, to catered lunches and bonus checks, to people who wore ambition like armor. I knew the little shop on Maple Street must seem like a toy village to him, something quaint and small and fragile. We sat there in the living room, facing each other across the gulf of years. He scrolled. I watched the fire. The silence was heavy. Not hostile, just weighty, like the pause after a song you both know ends, but you're waiting to see if the other remembers the next verse. I thought of the boy he used to be, the one who painted the garage walls with chalk galaxies, who danced with sparklers in the yard on summer nights, who used to fall asleep with his fingers still curled around colored pencils. I wondered when that boy had gone silent, when the magic had been replaced with margins and market shares. Did you have a good drive? I asked gently, trying to find a crack in the silence. Fine. Snow wasn't too bad. Car handles it. That's good. He hummed in vague agreement, eyes still fixed on his phone. His thumb paused for a moment, then flicked again. I could see the reflection of numbers and graphs flashing on the screen. I sipped my cocoa and swallowed the ache rising in my throat. It wasn't anger I felt. It was something softer and sadder, like watching a beautiful house you once lived in being turned into an office building. Your room's still the same, I said after a while. I washed the quilt. And the Star Mobile is still over the bed. He gave a small, almost embarrassed laugh. You didn't have to keep all that stuff, Mom. I wanted to. Another silence. The fire popped, sending a tiny ember spinning up the chimney. I tried to imagine what his life must look like now. Floor-to-ceiling windows. Suits the color of storm clouds. Colleagues who never laughed too loud. Phones that never stop vibrating. Maybe he'd stopped drawing entirely. Maybe he hadn't touched a paintbrush in 15 years. Dinner tomorrow at 6, I said, forcing cheer. I thought we could do all the old traditions. Sure, he murmured, not looking up. It was strange, how someone could be sitting right in front of you and still feel miles away. I excused myself to check on the pie cooling in the kitchen, but really I just needed a moment alone. I stood by the window over the sink, staring out at the snow falling in lazy spirals under the porch light. My reflection looked older than I remembered, lines like fine cracks in porcelain, hair pulled back in its usual loose bun. My hands were trembling. I pressed my palms flat to the counter and closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow would be better. He was tired, that was all. Long drive, long year. Tomorrow he'd come back to me a little. When I returned to the living room, he had stretched out on the couch, scrolling still, one arm behind his head. The cocoa sat untouched on the table, its steam gone. I picked up the mug and carried it back to the kitchen. The bell on the Christmas tree trembled slightly from the draft as I passed, giving a soft, silvery chime, like laughter from a memory. Upstairs, I lay awake long after the fire burned down to embers, listening to the wind sweep over the eaves, thinking about how quiet the house had been before he arrived, and how much quieter it felt now. It wasn't an angry quiet. It was the kind of quiet that echoes. The kind of quiet that comes when two people used to know each other, and now they don't. And as I drifted into a thin, uneasy sleep, I thought of the wooden box hidden in my closet, wrapped in gold paper and tied with red ribbon, waiting for him under the tree tomorrow. A small, fragile bridge, built from memories. Hoping, praying, it would be strong enough to carry us both across. Christmas morning dawned pale and soft, the sun just a faint glow behind curtains of drifting snow. The world outside seemed made of silence and light, but inside my little house, the air was alive with warmth. The oven hummed, the fire snapped and crackled, and the kitchen counters were crowded with platters, turkey roasting golden in the oven, cinnamon rolls cooling under a towel, bowls of cranberry compote glowing ruby red. The smell of pine from the tree blended with the buttery sweetness of baking bread, creating the scent of every Christmas I'd ever known. I moved through the house like someone caught in a memory, setting out plates and napkins with sprigs of holly tucked under them, lighting the taper candles on the table, checking the old clock on the wall as though time itself were something I had to manage like a fragile guest. I wanted everything to be perfect, not fancy, not like the parties Christopher was used to, but perfect in the way small, honest things can be when they're done with love. The Carters arrived just after noon, bundled in scarves and laughter. Tom Carter carried a casserole dish hot from their oven, and his wife, Ruth, brought her famous pecan pie, the one with the perfectly caramelized top. Their daughter Emily trailed behind them, all red cheeks and curls under her knit hat, holding a basket of spiced nuts wrapped in crinkly cellophane. "Merry Christmas, Eleanor," Ruth cried as soon as she stepped through the door, enveloping me in a hug that smelled of cinnamon and wool. "The house smells divine." "Thank you," I said, my voice catching just a little on the warmth in hers. Christopher descended the stairs just then, freshly showered, wearing a dark forest green sweater that brought out the hazel in his eyes. He looked like a man from a winter catalogue, polished, elegant, effortless. For a moment, I caught a flicker of the boy he'd been, standing there at the landing, smiling down at everyone. "Christopher," Ruth said brightly. "Look at you, all grown up and handsome. Boston's been treating you well, I see." He flashed his polished smile, the one I knew from photographs on his company's website. "Trying my best. It's good to see you all again." They gathered around him like moths to a warm light, and he shone for them. He laughed, told quick clever stories about office holiday parties and high-rise views, about flying to Chicago for meetings and having lunch at a restaurant where the plates cost more than my monthly utility bill. His voice was smooth and confident, full of an energy that filled the room. I stood by the kitchen doorway, watching him hold court with the Carters, his expensive watch catching the fairy lights on the tree like a spark of frost. Everyone laughed at his jokes. Even Tom, who usually saved his smiles like spare change, grinned widely at him. It was good, I told myself. It was good that he was happy, good that he felt at ease. But watching him from the edge of the room, I felt something tight coil around my heart. He seemed so far from me, even as he stood only a few feet away. Like I was looking at him through a pane of frosted glass. Dinner was served just as the snow outside began to glow pink in the sinking sun. We passed dishes around, carving the turkey, pouring gravy, spooning mashed potatoes and cranberry sauce. Conversation bubbled like champagne. Emily told us about her college classes, Tom teased her about eating nothing but instant noodles. Christopher laughed with them, listening with that slight tilt of his head he used when he was pretending to be deeply interested. When he spoke, it was with practiced ease, his sentences clean and deliberate, like they'd been edited beforehand. He told a story about negotiating a deal that saved his company millions, about the champagne they popped afterward, about the penthouse view over Boston glittering like a jewelry box at midnight. Everyone listened, eyes wide. I smiled and nodded where I should, but I couldn't quite swallow the lump in my throat. He was dazzling, yes. But dazzling in a way that hurt to look at for too long. After the meal, Ruth and I cleared the table while the others moved to the living room. The tree lights glimmered, and the fire danced low in the hearth. Christopher sank into the armchair with a tumbler of brandy, looking like he belonged in a magazine spread, the kind titled, "A Modern Gentleman's Holiday." Then came the presents. The Carters had gone all out, as they always did, shiny boxes wrapped in glossy paper, bows so perfect they could have been printed. There was laughter and tearing paper, the sound of surprise and delight as watches, sweaters, and gift cards appeared in people's hands. And then there was my gift. It sat small and plain in my lap, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of twine. Its plainness made it stand out in the glittering pile like a sparrow in a flock of peacocks. My fingers trembled as I smoothed the twine, waiting. "Your turn, Christopher," Ruth said, smiling at him. "Open your mother's gift." He smiled indulgently and leaned forward. "All right, let's see what Mom's brought us from the old shop." The words were teasing, but they had an edge that made the air tighten in my chest. I passed the little parcel to him. It looked so small in his hands. "Brown paper and string," Tom chuckled. "Old school. I like it." Christopher smiled, a little crookedly, and began to untie the twine. The room grew quiet, that soft kind of quiet that hums around the edges of something fragile. Even the fire seemed to lower its crackle. I clasped my hands together and held my breath. He peeled back the paper carefully, almost too carefully, as though afraid it might crumble. Beneath it was a wooden box, smooth and honey-colored, with his initials carved delicately on the lid. He raised his eyebrows. "Well, this is rustic." A nervous laugh fluttered from my throat. "Open it," I said softly. The world seemed to narrow to just the space between his hands and the box. He lifted the lid. And there, nested inside on a lining of soft blue velvet, were his drawings. Tiny framed pieces, each restored from the crumbling originals I'd found: the pirate ship with rainbow sails, the castle floating in the clouds, the robot orchestra. Colors vivid again, lines steady and proud. The dreams of a boy who once believed the world could be made magical by his hands. For a long moment, he just stared. No one spoke. I watched his face, trying to read it the way I once could when he was small and every thought of his past across him like sunlight through water. But now his face was unreadable. And my heart pounded like a trapped bird, not knowing if it was about to be freed, or broken. Christopher held the small brown paper package between his manicured fingers as if it might crumble and leave dust on his tailored sweater. The firelight flickered on his watch, on the sharp edges of his cufflinks, on the faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Wow," he said, his voice bright and cutting, carrying through the warm room like a shard of glass. "You really went all out, huh? Did the thrift shop have a sale?" There was a burst of laughter, but it wasn't the full kind. It came out thin, uncertain, like people weren't sure if they were allowed not to laugh. Ruth's smile faltered halfway across her face. Tom gave a quick nervous chuckle and looked down at his hands. Emily bit her lip. "And me?" I felt the heat rush to my cheeks so fast it made my ears buzz. I tried to laugh, to make it light, but the sound came out cracked. My hands twisted together in my lap, the skin around my knuckles pale. "It's not much," I said, forcing the words out softly, carefully, like trying to carry something fragile across a shaking bridge. "But it's from the heart." Christopher chuckled, smooth, dismissive. "I'm sure it is, Mom." He didn't even look at me when he said it. He set the box on the side table without opening it, like it was just another bit of clutter in the room, and immediately reached for the next glossy, ribbon-wrapped present someone had handed him. The air in the room shifted, subtle but sharp, like a window had been opened to a draft of cold. Conversation faltered, then picked up again, brittle as glass. I wrapped both hands around my teacup, though it had long gone cold, just to have something to hold. My fingers were trembling, so faintly I hoped no one could see. I smiled. I made myself smile. That was the thing about years of being a mother: you learned how to smile through almost anything. Through fevers and funerals, through slammed doors and sharp words, through the ache of watching someone you love become someone you barely recognize. He was laughing at something Tom said now, loud and easy, the way people laugh when they're showing the world how good their teeth look. The little wooden box sat there beside him, silent and small, the twine still neat around the brown paper. No one mentioned it. No one looked at it. No one looked at me. The room seemed to pull slightly away from me, like a tide sliding back. Their voices blurred, became soft and distant, like I was underwater. I stared at the box, at the delicate carved initials on its lid. I had spent weeks working on it, nights after closing the shop, kneeling on the old rug in my back room, spreading his drawings out around me like treasures. Choosing the best ones. Cleaning the edges, gently brushing away the years of dust. Asking old Mr. Bishop, the carpenter down the street, to carve the box from maple wood because I remembered how Christopher used to love the smell of it. All of that care, all of that love, and to him it was a joke. A thrift shop find. Something to laugh at. My chest felt hollow. I sipped my tea to hide the way my lips trembled, though it had gone bitter with tannin and time. I nodded along to whatever conversation they were having, though the words made no sense to me. "Can you imagine," Ruth was saying brightly, a penthouse that high? Oh, the view you must have, Christopher. Spectacular, he said, smiling. You can see the whole harbor. Especially at night, everything's lit up like diamonds. They made admiring sounds. He basked. I felt like furniture. At some point, Emily passed me a slice of pecan pie and I set it down on the table without tasting it. My fork made a small clink against the plate. No one noticed. Inside my chest, something was cracking, very quietly. It wasn't about the box. Not really. It was about how far away he was, even sitting right there. About how carefully I had stitched this Christmas together like a quilt, piece by piece, just to wrap it around him, and how easily he had shrugged it off. It was about how the boy who once drew castles in the clouds now looked at those memories like clutter. When the gift exchange ended, shiny ribbons littered the floor like bits of broken candy cane. Christopher stood to stretch, laughing about needing to walk off all that turkey. The Carters began bundling themselves back into their scarves and coats, all cheerful goodbyes and, thank you for having us, and, the food was amazing as always, Eleanor. I smiled. I hugged them. I thanked them for coming. I smiled even when Ruth's eyes flicked toward the little brown paper box still sitting unopened on the table and then quickly away, as though it were something delicate she didn't want to see break. The door closed behind them, and their voices faded into the snow-laden night. The house went quiet. Christopher stood by the fire, swirling the last sip of brandy in his glass, looking perfectly at home and perfectly distant. Thanks for dinner, Mom, he said casually, like thanking a waitress. You're welcome, I whispered. He didn't hear me, or pretended not to. He set his glass down and pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen glowing cold blue against the warm firelight. Upstairs, I could hear the faint creak of the house settling as the wind picked up outside, blowing snow against the windows in little hissing gusts. I gathered the torn wrapping paper into a bag, moving slowly, carefully, as though if I made too much noise something fragile inside me might shatter completely. My hands were steady now. Too steady. The little box was still on the table. I picked it up and held it against my chest for a moment, so quietly that he wouldn't see. I had thought this gift would be the bridge between us. Now it felt like a tiny raft, lost on an ocean. I placed it gently under the tree, where the golden lights painted soft halos on the floorboards. Maybe later, when the noise of the day had settled, when the shine of all the other presents had dulled, he might see it differently. Maybe when the fire was low and the house was quiet, he might remember who he used to be. But as he scrolled on his phone, the light flickering across his sharp, tired face, I wasn't sure anymore. I went into the kitchen to wash the dishes, letting the hot water scald my hands. It was better than feeling the cold that had settled in my heart. The house felt hollow after the Carters left, as if their laughter had been holding the walls together and now the silence had space to breathe. Outside, snow whispered against the windows, soft and relentless. The tree lights still glowed, but their cheer had faded into something quieter, like candlelight after a party, holding only echoes of joy. Christopher had loosened his collar and settled into the couch like a king back on his throne. One ankle rested casually over his knee. His phone glowed cold and blue in the dim room, illuminating the sharp angles of his face. He scrolled with one hand, eyes flicking, mouth set in that faint frown he always wore when he was somewhere far away. The little box sat on the coffee table in front of him, small and silent, wrapped in its plain brown paper. It looked almost fragile under the flickering light of the fire, like something left behind. He didn't look at it. Not once. I stood by the fireplace, my hands folded tightly together, staring at the shadows the flames painted on the walls. They danced and stretched, warped and bent with every crackle of the fire, like echoes of old memories. And I thought about Henry. How proud he had been of our boy. How he would sit on the porch in summer, watching Christopher race around the yard with his sketchbook, his hair flopping into his eyes, and smile that quiet, full smile of his. How he would say, underneath all that armor, he's still ours. Henry had believed in him with a faith so steady it could have been carved from stone. I wondered what Henry would say if he were here now, if he would still see the boy under the armor. Because all I saw was the armor. Steel and polish and sharp edges, layered so thick I couldn't tell where my son ended and the man he become began. I almost stepped forward, almost picked up the little box and carried it back to my room. My fingers twitched with the impulse. Maybe it had been a mistake. Maybe the past was a wound he didn't want reopened. Maybe my gift was foolish, naive, a relic of a boy who no longer existed. But something deep in me said wait. Wait. So I stood there by the fire, as still as the wooden angels on the mantel, and watched the light dance across his face. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Time had grown strange, stretched thin like sugar pulled into threads. Eventually, Christopher set his phone down with a sigh, rubbing the bridge of his nose like a man coming down from a long climb. The glow of the screen faded, leaving only the golden flicker of firelight and the soft twinkle of the tree. He leaned back into the cushions, eyes half-lidded. He looked tired in a way that went beyond his body. The house creaked as it always did in the winter night, settling like an old cat curling itself tighter. "Do you ever get lonely here?" he asked suddenly, his voice low, as though unsure if he wanted me to hear. The question startled me. I glanced at him. His eyes were still on the ceiling, not on me. "Sometimes," I said honestly. He nodded faintly, just once, as if that answer was exactly what he had expected. "I couldn't do it," he murmured. "This, quiet. It's too much." "You used to love the quiet," I said softly. "I was a kid," he replied, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. I wanted to tell him that being a kid didn't mean it hadn't been real. That the boy who lay on the grass and stared at the stars, sketching shapes between them, had been just as real as the man sitting here now. But my throat closed around the words. Instead, I turned my gaze back to the fire. We sat in silence. Not the comfortable kind that used to exist between us, when silence was just another shape of love. This was different, fragile, uneasy, full of unsaid things hovering like moths between us. His breathing slowed. His head tilted back on the cushion, his eyes sliding shut. For a moment, in that softened firelight, his face looked younger. Not like the little boy he once was, but like a version of himself that was just less guarded. The box caught the light, and my eyes went to it again. Still unopened. Still waiting. I thought about all the hours I had spent gathering those drawings, carefully pressing the fragile paper flat, brushing off specks of time, choosing the frames, asking Mr. Bishop to carve the initials into the lid just so. I thought about the quiet nights in my shop, sitting cross-legged on the floor with them spread around me like tiny doorways into the world he used to dream. He had made those drawings in the golden afternoons of his childhood, when the lights spilled across the floor and he'd chatter about flying ships and violin-playing robots, about making the world see the magic inside his head. How could he not want to see that again? How could he not even look? A memory came, sudden and sharp, the night before Henry died. He had been so weak then, his voice like wind through dry leaves, but he had taken my hand and whispered, "Promise me something. Don't let him forget who he is." And I had promised. Even if Christopher never knew it, I had promised. So I stood by the fire that night and waited. The clock ticked on the mantel, soft and patient. Snow hissed against the glass. At last, Christopher stirred. He opened his eyes, rubbed his face, and sat up straighter, glancing around as though surprised to find himself still here. His gaze snagged on the box for just a second, a fleeting flicker of curiosity or maybe irritation, before sliding away again. He rose and stretched, his silhouette tall and lean in the dim room. "I'm going to bed," he said. "All right," I replied. He hesitated. Just for a heartbeat. "Good night, Mom," he said, softer than I expected. "Good night, Christopher." His footsteps creaked up the stairs. A door closed. Silence flooded back in, vast and heavy. I sank into the chair he had left, staring at the box where he had sat so close and yet so far. The tree lights blinked gently, stubborn and hopeful, as if trying to keep breathing life into this night. I should have been asleep hours ago. My body ached with exhaustion. But I stayed there by the fire, watching the little box sit quietly under the weight of everything I had poured into it. Waiting. Because something deep in my bones told me this wasn't over. That the night still held its breath. That maybe, just maybe, Henry had been right. Underneath all that armor, he was still ours. Around midnight, when the house had sunk into that kind of silence so deep it hums in your ears, I sat in my armchair near the dying fire, half dozing. The snow outside was still falling, lazy and soft, tapping faintly against the windows like the quiet knocking of some forgotten memory trying to get in. The room smelled of pine and cooling embers, of cinnamon from the morning rolls, of everything that had once meant home. I thought Christopher had gone to bed. His old bedroom door was closed upstairs, and the last time I'd seen him, he'd been scrolling endlessly on his phone, eyes glazed with blue light. That image had haunted me all evening, his face lit not by wonder or laughter, but by cold, artificial glow, as if the world he lived in now was flat and digital, without texture or soul. I must have dozed for a while, because I was startled awake by a sound. Faint but unmistakable, the delicate rasp of paper tearing. I blinked and turned my head toward the coffee table. Christopher was sitting on the rug cross-legged, still in his crisp shirt, sleeves rolled up now, tie loose and askew. He looked younger like that, almost like the boy I remembered, the one who used to sprawl on the floor with markers fanned out around him like sun rays. In his hands, the small brown paper package lay half unwrapped. The twine had been unwound and set carefully beside him, and the paper peeled back like old bark to reveal the polished walnut box beneath, his initials, D.E., carved on the lid in the looping script Henry had once used to sign his fishing rods. Christopher's fingers hovered for a second as though he were afraid to touch it, and then he lifted the lid. The hinges gave a soft sigh, and for a moment, just a moment, time folded in on itself. Inside, under tissue paper, were the drawings. I'd chosen 20 of the best. Some were on yellowed loose leaf, some on torn pages from old sketchbooks. They smelled faintly of cedar from the storage room and of that waxy sweetness crayons leave behind. I'd had them gently cleaned and their edges matted in miniature frames, each with a brass tag engraved with the year he drew it. His breath hitched audibly. He reached for the first one with careful, almost reverent hands. It was his Cloud Castle, the one he'd drawn when he was 8, with turrets floating in the sky tethered to earth by thick golden chains. Little people waved from the windows, smiling stick-figure faces he had carefully inked with black pen over crayon. "These are mine," he whispered. His voice trembled like a string plucked too hard. "Yes," I said softly, setting my teacup down and leaning forward. "They were the first worlds you ever built." His thumb traced the edges of the paper, and his mouth quivered. I don't even remember drawing half of these." "I do," I murmured, the words barely making it past the lump in my throat. "You used to tell me you wanted to make the world see the magic inside your head." He swallowed, eyes darting quickly, as if he were searching the drawings for something he'd lost. There was the rainbow sail pirates he'd made at 10, ships with candy-colored sails chasing whales through a storm. The clockwork birds he'd sketched at 12, metallic sparrows with jeweled eyes and tiny brass gears for wings. The star dancer, a spindly figure twirling in the black void, her gown made of tiny stars cut from silver foil he'd glued down meticulously. Every drawing he touched seemed to strip away another layer of the man he'd become. His posture softened. His breathing slowed. The guarded sharpness in his eyes dulled to something fragile and human. "Mom," he said suddenly, his voice cracking in the middle, "I used to love this. I really loved it." "I know." He stared down at them, his jaw working like he was trying to keep it steady. "But I stopped. I don't even remember why I stopped." "You didn't stop," I said gently. "The world just got louder. And you forgot to listen to yourself." For a long time he didn't say anything. The fire gave a little sigh as it settled lower. Outside, a car passed on the distant road, its tires whispering on the snow. Then Christopher reached deeper into the box and pulled out the last piece, his astronaut orchestra. It had always been my favorite. A space station made of violins and pianos floating in orbit, with little helmeted figures strumming guitars among the stars. He had been 13 when he drew it, right after Henry built him a drafting table in the garage. Christopher's shoulders began to shake. A single tear slid down and landed on the glass frame, catching the firelight like a star. "Oh God," he whispered. "I don't know who I am anymore." The words hung in the air between us like frost. I moved quietly to the couch and lowered myself beside him. My knees popped as they always did now, but he didn't tease me about it the way he used to. He didn't even seem to notice. He was staring at the drawings as if they were holy scripture. "You're still him," I said. "He's buried under the noise, but he's still there. He always will be." Christopher covered his mouth with his hand and let out a shaky breath. "I thought you were. I don't know, giving me some sentimental thing. Like a joke." "It wasn't a joke," I said softly. "It's your soul, Christopher. I just kept it safe for a while." He turned to look at me then, really look at me, and I saw the boy I'd known flash through his eyes. The boy who once stayed up all night drawing a whole kingdom of talking cats just to make me laugh when I was sick. The boy who used to sit by the lake, sketching the way the sunset rippled like orange silk over the water. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "Of course you do," I said, and my voice wobbled. "You're my son." And then he did something I hadn't expected at all. He leaned against me, just a little, his head brushing my shoulder. Like he had when he was small. We sat there like that for a long time, not speaking. Just the crackle of the fire and the soft tick of the old clock on the mantel. I let my hand rest on his back, felt the tension slowly melt out of him in waves, as though he'd been holding himself upright for years and had finally remembered how to exhale. When he finally straightened, he wiped his eyes quickly with the heel of his hand, embarrassed. But there was a smile on his lips now. Not the sharp one he wore at parties or meetings. A soft, lopsided smile I hadn't seen since he was 15 and covered in charcoal smudges. "Thank you," he said. Just that. But it carried the weight of everything he couldn't yet say. I smiled. "Merry Christmas, Christopher." He placed the drawings back in the box one by one, as gently as if they were made of spun glass. Then he closed the lid and held it against his chest for a moment, like it was the only thing tethering him to something real. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet and endless. And for the first time in years, my house felt like home again. Christopher's eyes shimmered as if holding back a tide, the thin armor he wore, tailored suits, polished shoes, that cool detachment, finally cracking at the seams. He sank lower to the rug, the drawings slipping from his hands and fluttering around him like fragile snowflakes, each one landing with a whisper. For a long moment, he just stared at them, scattered pieces of his younger self lying exposed in the dim glow of the fire. "I gave it all up," he murmured, voice breaking in half. His shoulders caved inward, the proud line of his back collapsing as if the words themselves had weight. For what? For numbers on screens. Meetings. Deadlines. Charts that nobody will even remember a year from now. He drew in a shaky breath and let out a bitter laugh that was more like a sob. "I don't even paint anymore. I haven't picked up a brush in I don't even know how long." Something inside me ached so deeply it felt like it might splinter. I lowered myself to the rug beside him, my knees protesting. He didn't flinch as I placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. The heat of him, the sheer humanness, was startling after so many years of distance. "Those worlds are still inside you," I said softly. The words felt like a fragile thread between us, and I prayed they wouldn't snap. "You didn't lose them, Christopher. You just buried them under all the noise. But they're yours. They've always been yours." His mouth opened, then closed, as though he had 100 words caught in his throat and none of them could make it out. Then the first tear fell. It traced a line down his cheek and caught on his jaw before falling to the rug. And then another. And then more, until his chest heaved and the sobs came, not loud or dramatic, but raw and small, the kind of sobs that come from the very center of someone who has been silent for too long. I slid my arm around his shoulders and pulled him toward me, gently, the way I used to when he was small and feverish. And just like that, he broke. Completely. He folded into me, clutching me so tightly it hurt, his forehead pressed against my shoulder, the sobs shaking through him in waves. It was like holding both my grown son and my little boy at once, the man in the gray cashmere coat and the child with grass-stained knees and paint smudges on his cheeks, who once ran through the yard yelling that the clouds were ships sailing to secret lands. "I'm so tired," he whispered into my sweater, the words muffled, trembling. "I thought if I just made enough money, climbed high enough, everyone would be proud. That I would be proud. But it's all just empty." I rubbed his back slowly. "It's not pride you're missing," I said. "It's joy." The room was so quiet you could hear the old mantel clock ticking in steady beats, as if it were giving us permission to take our time. The fire crackled low, casting long shadows across the drawings scattered on the floor. He pulled back a little, wiping his face with the heel of his hand, though more tears slid out anyway. "I don't even know how to get it back," he said, broken-voiced. "That part of me. That kid. He's gone." "He's not gone," I said, holding his gaze firmly even when his eyes flickered away. "He's been waiting. He's just waiting for you to come home." Something in his face faltered then, the hard set of his jaw trembling, and he let out a shuddering exhale as if releasing years of pressure. For a while we just sat there in the glow of the fire, surrounded by the ghosts of his imagination, the clockwork birds, the cloud castles, the astronaut orchestra. I could almost see the boy he'd been sitting cross-legged among them, grinning up at us with crayon on his fingers. When Christopher finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost wondering. "Do you think it's too late? To try again? Too late?" I gave a soft laugh, shaking my head. "You're 32. Van Gogh didn't start painting seriously until his late 20s. Tolkien wrote The Hobbit when he had 3 children and a full-time job. The only thing it's too late for is being miserable forever." A watery smile ghosted across his lips, fragile but real. He let out a shaky laugh that sounded almost like relief. "I don't even know if I'd be any good anymore," he whispered. "You don't have to be good," I said. "You just have to be you." He stared down at the drawings again, his fingertips grazing the glass edges like he was afraid they'd disappear. "I don't know if I remember how to begin." "You begin the way you did back then," I said. "With one line." Silence wrapped around us again, but it was different now, not heavy like it had been, not full of all the things left unsaid. This was a softer silence, like snow falling on open fields. A silence that made room for something new. Christopher gathered the drawings back into the box slowly, carefully, almost reverently. When he set the lid back on, he held it to his chest for a long moment, eyes closed. His breathing evened out. The tension in his jaw eased. "I used to draw on the window glass when it frosted over," he murmured, eyes still shut. "Little dragons and spaceships. You'd yell at me for smudging the glass." "I never yelled," I said with a smile. "I just said you'd leave fingerprints. You said they were the fingerprints of dreams." He opened his eyes, and for the first time all night, they weren't distant or cold. They were the warm hazel I remembered, glinting like sunlight through honey. "I remember that." My throat tightened. "So do I." He was quiet for a long time after that, just watching the fire. And then he said, almost to himself, "Maybe I could start with something small. A sketch. Just to see what happens." My heart caught on the words like a hook. "I think that would be wonderful." We stayed there on the floor until the fire burned down to glowing embers. Eventually, he helped me to my feet and we carried the box carefully upstairs to his old room. He set it on the desk that still stood by the window, the same desk where he once spent hours drawing dragons and heroes. He brushed a thin layer of dust off the surface with his palm. When he turned back to me, there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Not certainty, not yet, but a spark. A flicker. A boy-shaped ember glowing in the ashes of a man who'd forgotten who he was. "Thank you, Mom," he said, voice low and steady now. "For not giving up on me." I reached up and smoothed a lock of hair off his forehead like I used to when he was small. "I never will." And for the first time in so long it almost startled me, he leaned down and kissed my cheek. Just a soft brush of warmth. But it felt like the crack of dawn breaking through a long winter night. We stood there for a moment, just smiling at each other in the dim hallway light, neither of us needing to say anything more. Something broken had shifted, not magically healed, but mending, stitch by stitch, breath by breath. As I walked back to my room, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. He was standing at the window, holding one of the drawings up to the moonlight, his silhouette softened by the glow. And in that moment, I could almost see it, the boy he'd been, and the man he might yet become, standing in the same place at last. The first light of Christmas morning slipped like a pale ribbon through the curtains, soft and gold and impossibly still. Outside, Cedar Hollow lay buried under a fresh quilt of snow, the whole world hushed as though holding its breath. The pines bowed gently beneath their white crowns, and the narrow street was untouched. No tire tracks, no footprints, only silence and grace. I padded quietly into the living room, expecting to find the couch empty, the house once again mine alone. But there he was, Christopher, still awake. He was curled up at one end of the couch like a boy who had fallen asleep mid-adventure, his expensive coat discarded in a heap on the floor, sleeves turned inside out like shed skin. In his lap rested my old sketchbook, the battered one I used to keep on the shop counter to jot down notes or doodle while waiting for customers. His head was bent low, his eyes scanning the pages, and for a moment I simply watched him. His hair was mussed, his posture unguarded, the mask of the sharp-tongued finance man nowhere to be seen. He didn't look like an executive this morning. He looked like my son, the boy who used to sit cross-legged on this very rug, humming while he drew whole kingdoms on printer paper. A floorboard creaked beneath me and he looked up. And there it was. Something new, or maybe something ancient, something that had never really left, flickered in his eyes. It was subtle, like the glow of a candle rekindled after years of darkness. Not triumph, not pride, not the clipped confidence he wore like armor in his city life, but softness. Wonder. A spark of that wild magic he'd once carried so easily. "Good morning," I whispered. He blinked slowly, then closed the sketchbook with care, as though it were made of glass. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from disuse, but gentle. "You didn't sleep?" He shook his head. "Couldn't. I kept seeing things. Not like hallucinations," he added with a small laugh, "just memories, I guess. Ideas. Pictures." He looked down, as though embarrassed. "It's been a long time since my brain wanted to make pictures." I crossed the room and sank onto the other end of the couch, tucking my feet under me. The fire had long gone out, but the room still smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon and something older, like home. He stared at the sketchbook for a long moment, then looked at me. His voice was quiet but steady. "Thank you." I tilted my head. "For what?" "For not giving up on me," he said. He didn't look away, didn't mask the words with a grin or a shrug. He just said them, plain and unadorned, and I felt them settle into my bones like warmth. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, the two of us, watching sunlight creep across the snow outside and turn the drifts to molten gold. The house held a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years, like a cathedral of quiet built just for us. Eventually, I said softly, "Merry Christmas." He gave a small laugh. "Merry Christmas, Mom." I rose and shuffled to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and poured us both mugs of cocoa the way he used to like it, extra milk, barely any sugar. When I came back, he had opened the sketchbook again. On a blank page near the back, he had drawn something new. Just rough lines, only the hint of a form, but I could see it, the beginnings of a dragon, wings unfurled, its body coiling across the paper like smoke. It took my breath away. He caught me staring and flushed a little, ducking his head like a shy child. "It's nothing," he mumbled. Just seeing if my hands remember. They do, I said, my voice catching. They absolutely do. We sat together with steaming mugs between our palms, and for the first time in years, we didn't talk about stocks or markets or schedules. We didn't talk about Boston or quarterly projections or how busy he was. We didn't even mention the future. We talked about colors. About how shadows could make a painting breathe, and how red was the most defiant color because it refused to be ignored. We talked about shapes, how circles felt safe, and triangles felt urgent, and how as a boy he had once tried to draw an entire city made of spirals. We talked about stories, the kind you build with your hands and your heart, the kind that live inside pictures and brushstrokes and dreams, not spreadsheets. He told me how, as a child, he believed that if he drew something well enough, it might come to life. I told him how, even as an adult, I sometimes believed the same thing. And he smiled, not that sharp, fleeting smile he wore at cocktail parties, but something slower, deeper. The kind of smile that starts somewhere buried and has to climb its way back to the surface. The morning moved gently around us. Sunlight climbed the walls. The kettle whistled again, the clock ticked. The world outside was still frozen and silent, but here, in this little living room in Cedar Hollow, something had begun to thaw. At one point he reached out and touched my hand, not briefly or awkwardly, but with intention, holding it between his like he used to when he was small and scared of thunderstorms. I felt the steady beat of his pulse, warm and alive, and for the first time in years it didn't feel like there was a canyon between us. I don't know what comes next, he said quietly. But I want it to be different. I want to find that part of me again. You don't have to know the whole path, I said. You just have to take the first step. He nodded slowly, as though letting the words settle inside him like roots. We stayed there for hours, just talking. Not the brittle small talk of holidays past, but real talk, the kind that loops and drifts, touching old memories and new hopes. He told me about the first time he had sat in a skyscraper office and realized the view didn't make him happy. I told him about how, after Henry died, I sometimes whispered to the books on the shop shelves just to hear a voice answer back. It felt like two people weaving a new bridge between them, plank by plank. Later, he rose and went to the window. Snow still glittered unbroken across the yard. He lifted his phone like he might check something, then stopped. Slowly, deliberately, he set it face down on the sill. He stood there for a long moment just watching the snow fall, his breath fogging the glass, his reflection faint and soft beside the world outside. When he turned back, his eyes were clear. Tired, yes, but bright. I think, he said, I'm going to stay a little longer. My throat tightened. I'd like that. He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around me. It wasn't hurried or polite. It was the kind of embrace that says everything words can't. And as I held him, feeling his heartbeat steady against mine, I realized something simple and profound. For the first time in years, I had my son back. Not the man who chased numbers in glass towers, but the boy who once believed the world was full of magic. And who, maybe, was beginning to believe it again. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who might need a gentle reminder that it's never too late to come home to what truly matters. Leave a comment about a dream you once set aside, and how you might begin nurturing it again. Your story could inspire someone else to rediscover theirs. And if you want more heartfelt tales about love, loss, and finding our way back to each other, subscribe to this channel and turn on the bell. Together, let's keep these stories alive, one heart, one memory, one hope at a time.